It would be fine if Israel took over the entire Middle East, more or less. That is the statement of Mike Huckabee, who is the United States ambassador to Israel. Now, we're going to go through his extraordinary interview with Tucker Carlson, in which Mike Huckabee humiliates himself, wraps himself up in knots, is unable to answer basic questions, makes false assertions, including outrageous false claims about the number of Palestinian civilians killed by the Israeli army, of course armed and facilitated by the US. Now, before we continue, I know there are those who object to using material from Tucker Carlson, long associated with far-right US politics. And I want to make clear, I object, of course, as a socialist, to Tucker Carlson's politics. Here's what matters here. This is crucial documentary and historical evidence about US complicity in the crime of crimes, which is genocide. Specifically here, of course, Israel's Western-facilitated genocide of the Palestinian people. We cannot disregard and ignore crucial documentary and historical evidence about US complicity in the worst possible crime it is possible to commit, because we object to the political character of the journalist who has secured that evidence. It is a damning indictment of the Western media that it is left to someone like Tucker Carlson to amass this crucial evidence. That's because the Western media has itself helped facilitate Israel's genocide, because if it had done its job and properly held to account Western leaders, this genocide would not have been possible. Let's start with this clip.
You've appealed to Genesis. Genesis 15 says it's Abram, it's pre-Abraham, it's Abram, receives from God the news that his descendants will inherit the land. And you tell me as the theologian if I'm getting this wrong, but from the Euphrates to the Nile. I think that's right. And that would include basically the entire Middle East. That would be the Levant, so that would be Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. It would also be big parts of Saudi Arabia and Iraq. It would be,
I'm not sure it would go that far. I mean, it would be a big piece of land, but here's the point.
It would be a lot of places that are now countries.
But this particular area that we're talking about now, Israel, is a land that God gave through Abraham to a people that he chose. It was a people, a place, and a purpose. We can look at it that way. Christian Zionism, I want to go back because that's where we started on this.
I'm not going to let you off on this because you have said it 3 times that God gave this land to this people. And so it is entirely fair for me with respect to ask, what land are you talking about? Because I just read Genesis 15, as I have many times. And that land, I think it says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have the right to that land? Because you're appealing to Genesis. You're saying that's the original deed.
It would be fine if they took it all.
It would be fine if Israel took it all. The entire Middle East, more or less. This is a position which Mike Huckabee, the US ambassador to Israel, arrives at based on his fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity. We're not dealing here with some random religious crackpot. This is the official representative of the United States to Israel, someone with huge responsibilities, huge power and influence in terms of determining US policy towards Israel and the Middle East. Israel, of course, being a state dependent on the US when pursuing its own aims and objectives, because it's supplied with weapons, aid, diplomatic and political support from the United States. It's worth just noting a glaring double standard here. Islamophobia, that is prejudice and hatred against Muslims, is rampant and acceptable in Western society. Muslims are routinely portrayed as innately extremist and dangerous with fanatical views. If a prominent politician in a state hostile to the West used Islam to justify aggressive, illegal expansionism of a state, they would be denounced as an extremely dangerous Islamist extremist. Yet where were all the denunciations of this Christian extremism from one of the most senior representatives of a admittedly flailing superpower? Now, I bet hearing the term Christian extremism seems odd because you're not used to hearing it. Again, this is a Christian fundamentalist in a position of huge power and influence in the world's most powerful nation. What this reveals to us is the role of the United States in facilitating Israel's expansionist ends. Expansionism of a supremacist project. Israel illegally occupies the West Bank and has de facto annexed it. It has designs on Gaza, which of course it occupies, which involves several of its leaders explicitly endorsing colonizing it. That's only for starters, though. Israel illegally occupies part of Syria and is repeatedly attacking it. It has repeatedly invaded Lebanon and is constantly attacking that country and committing war crime after war crime. It has attacked Iran, of course. It has committed multiple war crimes in its attacks on Yemen. It even attacked Qatar, a Western ally, and its leaders have repeatedly made clear their support for a greater Israel. That includes Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister and de facto governor of the West Bank, who once displayed a greater Israel map, including Jordan, and who declared Israel would eventually extend to Damascus in Syria. But it also includes Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who told Israeli television that he feels he is on a historic and spiritual mission, and that he's very attached to the promise, the vision of the promised land and greater Israel. We can't dismiss such schemes simply as the insane dreams of the most extreme Israeli leaders. We know that US leaders include those who believe Israel has the right given by God to seize the land of other nations. Now let's listen to this.
Israel goes to lengths that no other country, including ours, goes to in the middle of an urban war, and yet Israel ended up with fewer civilian deaths in an urban war than any urban war of record.
You said you didn't know how many civilian deaths there were, so how can you say that?
If you took Gaza's numbers, Hamas's numbers,
you said you don't know what the numbers are.
We don't.
You just told me that. Then how can you say it's a lower number?
But if you took the numbers that they reported, which is like 50,000, 25,000 of those were actual warriors. How many civilians? If you took all of their numbers,
range from 120 to 78. Those ones I just read. I don't know if that's real. I don't know either. I'm asking you.
Yeah, and I'm telling you, those numbers I've not heard, have not read. The numbers that I think are more reportable are somewhere in the 60,000 range.
Where do those come from?
From the Gaza Health Ministry,
but which you said those were invalid numbers.
I think they are. I don't think that they're accurate, but I'm saying
You're saying they're inaccurate, but they prove that Israel's doing a great job?
Let's assume that the most widespread numbers, the largest numbers that have been reported out of Gaza by Hamas,
yes,
let's assume they're true. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying they are true, but assume they're true. Let's just take them at their word. Then you still have a lower number of civilians killed than in any urban warfare environment in modern history. Fact.
Is that a fact?
Yes.
What are you comparing it to?
To any urban warfare.
Name one.
Iraq.
Where in
Afghanistan?
Iraq? Where in Iraq? Where in Afghanistan? There aren't many urban areas in Afghanistan. I don't think there was any fighting in urban areas in Afghanistan.
Kabul?
I don't know. Were there pitched battles in Kabul over long periods of time? I don't.
20 years.
In Kabul? I don't.
Throughout all of Afghanistan.
But what were those rates?
You're talking about what are the rates there? The number of people who were killed into the tens of thousands. I'm asking you to.
I don't know the answer. I've never heard of any of this. You brought it up. You said the IDF has killed a lower proportion of civilians in urban warfare than in any urban conflict in modern history. I'd never heard that before. I don't know what are the controls for that. And you said, well, the U.S. military killed more civilians.
Would you agree that the real tragedy was that Hamas continued to force this war?
Hold on. You just again said that the IDF is more humane than the United States military. You just said that. You said in Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military killed more civilians than the IDF did in Gaza. You just told me that. I never heard that before. And my question is, how do you know that? What are those numbers?
And I'm trying to explain to you that there were extraordinary efforts to keep
the numbers, do you?
I think they were tens of thousands. I'll get them for you.
Well, you brought it up. That's the only reason I'm pushing
you. But I'm wearing a flag. I work for a country, and you pretended or alleged that somehow I'm not loyal to this and that I'm criticizing my own country, and I'm not.
They did a better job than the U.S. military in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I said, what are the numbers? And you said, I don't know. So on what basis are you making the claim that the IDF in Gaza spared more civilians than the U.S. Army and Marine Corps did in Afghanistan and Iraq? Why are you saying that? Like, on what basis are you saying that?
From the conversations that I've had with the people who fought there. And I don't have the exact numbers for you.
Firstly, the figures in terms of those killed in Gaza by the Israeli army used by Mike Huckabee are just wrong. The official death toll is over 75,000. But as multiple academic and peer-reviewed studies have shown, that toll is a drastic underestimate. The Lancet, the most prestigious medical journal on earth, has just published a study looking at the number of Palestinians killed between the 7th of October 2023 and the 5th of January 2025. So it stops over a year ago. They did this by conducting a population representative household survey, surveying over 2,000 households in Gaza, in which they documented the vital status, are they alive or dead, of 9,729 members of those households plus newborns. They estimated, based on that, 75,200 violent deaths in that first 14 months of the genocide. So excluding violent deaths since then, and bear in mind the huge levels of violence that Israel orchestrated against Palestinians in the following months, the so-called ceasefire was arrived in October. And although there is less violence than there was before, hundreds of Palestinians, of course, have been killed since then. But before that October fake ceasefire, we're talking thousands and thousands more Palestinians being killed violently. But that figure, nonetheless, meant somewhere between 3 and 4% of Gaza's pre-genocide population being violently killed in the space of 14 months. That was compared to the official Ministry of Health figures of 49,090 violent deaths in that period. So significantly lower than 75,200 violent deaths, that official estimate. It was, in fact, a third lower than the central estimate of these researchers. So they also estimated on top of that 8,540 excess non-violent deaths. That is, people who died as a consequence of the genocide who would not have died otherwise, for example, because of lack of medical care. That is an estimate, I should say, that's significantly lower than other studies, but nonetheless, those indirect deaths are not included in Gaza's official death toll. So that means 82,740 deaths due to the genocide in that first 14 months, much, much higher than the official estimates. There were other studies. The Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research arrived at a very similar figure for almost the same time period. Between 7th October 2023 and 31st of December 2024, 78,318 people in Gaza suffering violent deaths with a reduction of life expectancy of 44% in 2023 and 47% in 2024. Their estimate of the total number of violent deaths in the first 2 years of the genocide was between nearly 100,000 and nearly 126,000, with a median estimate of just over 112,000. Now, The Economist, which backed Israel's genocide, estimated between 77,000 and 109,000 violent deaths, excluding indirect deaths, between 7th of October 2023 and 5th of May 2025. So excluding deaths after that, and thousands of Palestinians suffered violent deaths after that. So in terms of the percentage of the population killed, we're talking about 4 to 5 to 6% from violent deaths in the space of 2 years. As the Israeli newspaper Haaretz detailed in 2024, in the war in Syria, rightly regarded as an appallingly bloody war, an estimated 2% of the population died in the space of 13 years. So that is less than half, reasonably, based on those estimates, reasonably estimating, half the proportion killed in Gaza, but over a much longer space of time, over 6 times longer. In Iraq, the war killed an estimated 1% of the population over 20 years. By the way, I mean, when we're talking about this, because you think, well, these are single figures, the violent killing of even 1% of a population is catastrophic. I mean, it's a devastating impact on a society. But the point here is a much higher proportion of Gaza's population was killed in a much shorter space of time. Now, in terms of the proportion of civilians killed, it's striking that this supposed patriot claims that Israel does more to protect civilians than his own country. As it happens, the US has committed multiple heinous war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq and other countries. But his claims about the onslaught against Gaza killing a lower proportion of civilians than any other form of urban warfare, he has no facts to back up his claims because none exists. As per the work of Air Wars, a hugely respected NGO which examines the consequences of aerial bombardment, this was the deadliest by far air war they'd ever examined. They looked at 606 incidents of civilian harm in the first 25 days of genocide alone, and according to what they said are their most conservative estimates, in those first 25 days, at least 5,139 civilians were killed in the sample, it's only a sample of 606 attacks they analysed. And they found evidence of casualties of Hamas militants being killed in just 4% of those attacks, 26 cases. The number of militants they believed had been killed in all of those attacks, which killed thousands of civilians, between 32 and 60. What on earth is Mike Huckabee talking about with Kabul, by the way? There wasn't any intense urban fighting between the US and its allies and the Taliban or other insurgents in Kabul. The man is completely ignorant and plucking nonsense out of thin air. The intense warfare was overwhelmingly waged, as Tucker Carlson notes, in rural Afghanistan. As the leaked data of the Israeli army found, the proportion of civilians killed by Israel in Gaza was 83%. That's the leaked data of Israel's own army. These are just lies, barefaced lies and ignorance. Now let's examine this fascinating chunk. Fascinating, that is, for all the wrong reasons.
In the entirety of the world, there are about 16 million Jews total. And 8 million of them live here. The rest live mostly in New York or South Florida and a few other places.
Okay.
So this is a small population of people. They have connection to this land historically, biblically.
Do they?
Yes, they do.
If Bibi's family, we know they lived in Eastern Europe. There's no evidence they ever lived here. He's not religious.
But
in what sense?
How do we know that?
Do you have his family tree? No, we don't.
Do you?
He doesn't. So no one does. That's the point.
But
so how do we know that he has any connection to this land at all?
And if there has been a practice of Judaism and a connection to the language, the Bible, the land.
His ancestors didn't. He doesn't practice Judaism in any rigorous way. His ancestors didn't live here. They didn't speak the language, and there's no evidence they ever lived here. So on what basis does he have a right to be here?
Very much speaks the language. He has fought for the land. His family has fought for the land.
You're dodging a very obvious question, which is, where does this right come from? And the reason it's meaningful is because there are a lot of people in the territory that Israel controls today, particularly in the West Bank, who, through genetic testing, we can know their families have been here for thousands of years. We don't know whether they practiced Judaism, whether they were Samaritans, pre-Islam. We don't know that. A lot of them we know have been Christians for 2,000 years. They have less of a right to the land than someone whose ancestors, the only thing we know about them is they lived in Latvia or Poland. They're Eastern European. How does that work?
They're Jewish.
By what definition?
They're Jewish by their
But how do we know they have any connection
They're
to
Jewish
the Jews
by their faith. They're Jewish
Bible?
by the connection to the language. Jewish by the connection to the Torah.
But how do we know that Bibi, specifically Bibi's ancestors, ever lived here? How do we know that?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
How do we know if the Prime Minister of Israel's ancestors ever lived?
Maybe I could ask you, how do we know they didn't? I mean,
well, it's on the basis of the claim that they did that all kinds of things happen. People are displaced. There's a money flow. I mean, it's a big question. A lot hangs on this. It's not some theoretical thing like, oh, did my grandparents do this or do that? It's like, no, we have a right to be here because my ancestors were here. Okay, how do we know they were here?
I'm totally unable to process what you're trying to get at.
Well, it's a perfectly clear question for him to answer. He's choosing not to answer the question, not because he doesn't understand it. He's pretending to be stupid. It's because there is no answer to that question. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is one example. Can he prove that he has ancestry going back hundreds of years, 2,000 years, to what is now the state of Israel? No, he doesn't. And, that is provided as the basis for someone like Benjamin Netanyahu to be able to claim land in Israel. The onus is on Mike Huckabee to prove whether or not someone like Benjamin Netanyahu has that right. Not that right, whether he could prove that he has family heritage, which is then used as this justification. But in any case, the obvious contradictions of Zionism here are on full display. Do you claim that the basis of Palestinians being violently displaced from their land is that Jewish people have the right to that land based on religion, ethnicity, or indeed both? And however you cut it, you are going to wrap yourself up in knots. That's because you end up in the terrain of the mystical and the supernatural and genetic testing. Many of the Palestinians today are the direct descendants of Jewish people who have lived in that land for thousands of years, but then at some point converted to Christianity or to Islam, or to Christianity and then Islam, or who knows, maybe even some from Islam to Christianity. David Ben-Gurion, who was the first Prime Minister of Israel, himself believed that Palestinians had descended from the Jewish people. Now, as an article in the Times of Israel discussed a decade ago, DNA findings have backed up the fact that Palestinian Arabs are very close to Ashkenazi Jews in their genetic makeup. Jewish people with heritage from Palestine and Palestinians descended from the Canaanites. They have a common ancestry. They're very, very, very similar. Now, one Israeli historian interviewed in the Jerusalem Post back in 2009 even said that he could declare with certainty that nearly 90% of all Palestinians are descended from the Jews. But as Tucker Carlson also noted, while some Jewish people absolutely can trace their family in whole or in part back to Palestine, others cannot. The Israeli historian Shlomo Sand notes that a large number of Jewish people today are descendants of those who converted to Judaism. He refutes the claim that Jewish people were forcibly expelled from Jerusalem, which is obviously a founding claim, and also noted that Jewish communities lived all over the Mediterranean before the Second Temple fell, rather than there's just only being this mass dispersal. He argues that most Jewish people did not in fact leave and ended up converting to Islam. His research also looks at those who lived around the Caucasus who converted to Judaism between the 4th and the 13th century. There is not one singular Jewish people who are the descendants of people who lived in that land. It's just not true. And given Mike Huckabee is basing his claims, his support for Zionism, Christian Zionism, on religion, what about the fact that about a fifth of Jewish Israelis did not believe in God? What about the fact that a third never attend synagogue? What about another large proportion who say they only attend on an infrequent basis, like once a year? What about the fact that only 30% of Jewish Israelis say that religion is very important in their lives? Would they have been recognized as Jewish in a meaningful way centuries ago? No, they would not. That doesn't mean I'm denying, by the way, that I regard them as Jewish, because today we understand being Jewish as an ethnicity, where you can be an atheist and Jewish, but that doesn't square with Mike Huckabee's religious justification for Zionism, because what we're talking about here, the concept of that as an ethnicity didn't previously exist. It was, did you believe in the religion or not? Were you an adherent? Were you a worshipper? Not other justifications, which again are important and meaningful for people's identity. And I would never deny that in terms of people's identity. You know, I have Jewish family. They're not, you know, people who necessarily subscribe to Jewish religious tenets at all, but they're still Jewish. That right to an identity doesn't then give you a right to take other people's land. Now, this interview is deeply revealing. It helps us understand the thinking at the top of the power which Israel depends on, the United States, including religious extremism, contempt for Palestinian life, contempt for the rights of Arabs, and an outright belief in ethnic and religious supremacy and expansionism. And it helps us understand what we're up against. Please like and subscribe if you thoughts or your comments help us take on the pro-Dan Insider Media at patreon.com/owners84. Do share the video. Leave your thoughts, your comments. Always read those. And I'll speak to you in a bit.